All right, welcome back. We start? Thank you. Any questions before you get started? Anything on your minds? Is that a hand? Okay, that's okay. All right, we are continuing and actually wrapping up our topic on family law. In our first two classes, we talked about family law and marital property in common law jurisdictions. And by common law, I don't mean old fashioned, I mean states with common law property systems. Today, we are turning to the other one, marital property in community property states. Okay. A few points to review before we get started. When we're talking about marital property, we really care about 2 points in time. We care about divorce and death. In common law states, the husband and wife are allowed to have separate property. But that creates a problem. What happens if in the will, the husband dies and he leaves his wife nothing? The common law states develop what's called the elective share, the modern elective share. And the purpose of the elective share is to prevent the husband from writing his wife out of the will. So at least the wife can request half of the probate assets if there are no kids, and a third if there are kids. Okay? Those are the rules for common law states. Today we're talking about community property states. Right? In community property states, it's a different regime. It's virtually impossible for a husband to write a wife out of a will. You'll see why later in class today. As a result, there's not going to be any elective share in a community property jurisdiction. But the rules are different. There are several big differences. Joint tenancies operate differently. Equitable distribution operates differently. Insurance policies operate differently. Almost everything in a community property regime operates differently. In the end result, the wife or the surviving spouse ends up in roughly the same place as she would in a common law jurisdiction. But there are differences. Any questions before we get started? All right. Let's do a question before we begin. Question number 1. True or false question. The elective share is available in community property states. True or false? Another 10 seconds. And who's next? You seem really uncertain about that. Oh, she's next. She's not. No. The empty chair next to you is next. It was Maddie. Debbie. You expect me to know your names? Okay. That's Maddie. Debbie's there. I'm actually just very good with names. I think I'm almost there. If I find a lot of names, I'll forget them all. It's actually terrible. It's like I know your names and then just evanesces over the summer. All right, Andres. All right, go ahead, my friend. What's your answer here? The answer I'm looking for is false. I'm actually happy that 95% of you got this right. My other class, like 85% got this right, and 15% didn't hear what I said 30 seconds earlier. So you're right. The answer here is false. There are some weird quirks where a couple who is married in a community property state can actually seek an elective share. We'll get to later, but this is easily false. So good for the 95% of you. The 3% of you, listen better. I just said it. But this is important. And the reason why this question is important is because in today's class, there's no elective share. Everything we're covering today is in a community property state. where there is not going to be a forced elective share, or a modern elective share as they're called. That point is actually very significant. Okay? So let's walk through community property. Again, it exists in about 10 states. It's Arizona, California, Idaho, Louisiana, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, Washington, and Wisconsin, Alaska, apparently joined the club. These are all the community property jurisdictions. Okay. The basic definition, right, or the basic understanding of a community property jurisdiction is that the husband and wife own everything together. They're not separate shares in property. They all have the same interest. And the husband has half of that interest, and the wife has half that interest, right? They all own the same interest, and they have different percentages of each. So it's 50-50, everything. Okay. Any income that either spouse earns is presumptively community property. Any income is presumptively community property. What do I mean by presumptively? Unless there's a written agreement saying that this income belongs only to spouse number one, the presumption is it's going to be community property. It doesn't matter if the husband has a separate bank account. That really doesn't matter. Any income coming into the marriage is considered community. Any property purchased during the marriage, they buy Blackacre. Any property purchased is presumptively community property. Whether or not it's titled a joint tenancy doesn't matter. They call it a joint tenancy or tenancy in common. I don't really care what you call it. We'll explore this later. It's going to be a community property. Okay. The exceptions to this rule are very narrow. Inheritances are separate property. So if you're married and you inherit some property, that's separate. Gifts. If someone gives a gift to one spouse, that gift is going to be considered separate property. But virtually everything else is presumptively community. And it's called what's called preponderance of the evidence standard, right? You have to show it's more likely than not that you intend to keep things separate. That's very hard to show. In any marriage, you don't need it in writing, but that's probably what you're going to end up needing. Right? You say, oh, sweetie, remember you said this was my separate bank account with $1 million? No, that's not going to work. Right? The presumption is if you're married and you have some assets during the marriage, it's community property. This presumption becomes very, very important when you're dividing up assets upon divorce. Because often the two partners do not agree over what is community, but the bottom line is it's going to be community property. You have to divide up. Okay. All right. How does this actually work? Everything that the husband and wife have that's community property is owned jointly. 50-50. Okay. These are undivided shares. Husband has a 50% interest and wife has a 50% interest. Right down the middle. So look at question number 2. Okay, this will be for no, don't tell me. Give me the first letter. What? V. Victoria. Yeah, nailed it. Yeah, okay. I have to play through. No, I'm running. They're making her because on their name tags, but I'm still trying. Okay. All right, so we're Victoria. Okay. All right. So husband and wife are married in Texas. Husband earns a salary of $1,000, which he deposits in his personal bank account. Okay. Then the husband buys 10 shares of stock with that money. The shares are titled in H's name only. Then, boo-hoo, they get divorced. That's me. I'm sorry, but they get divorced. In this class, everyone's getting divorced. In the last class, A's always dying, right? The A for life and A dies. Here, they always get divorced in every question, or they die, I suppose. What will W receive through an equitable distribution of the assets? 0 shares, 5 shares, $0, $500. All right, take another 15 seconds and put an answer in, please. Yeah, in this class, everyone's either dying or getting divorced. It's actually very sad. No one ever lives happily ever after in this class. It doesn't happen. Because that's not a good property question to live happily ever after. There's nothing for me to ask about. It's true. All right, Victoria, what is your answer here?
5 shares.
Okay, why do you say 5 shares? Guys, one is please. She's talking. Go ahead. Good point. Yeah, that's actually a really good answer. Good 90. Oh, good. You guys are doing better than the other section. I'll see you all. So the answer's already right. But it's 90%, 5 shares. That's correct. And let me explain why. When the $1,000 was in the account, that was considered community property. They both had access to the entire amount. When the husband bought the 10 shares, which were in his name, we presume the wife consented to that purchase. We presume. Why? When you're married in a community property state, you're not really allowed to make a purchase without your spouse's consent. I mean, you can, but you risk the wife coming back saying, "Excuse me, I did not consent. Give me half of it back." Right? So any purchase or any transaction you make, if your spouse does not concur with it, you risk losing that during a divorce proceeding. So we presume the wife was okay with him buying the 10 shares. And then after the 10 shares were purchased, those were marital property, community property. And during a divorce, you split that in half, 50-50. Now, I think Victoria actually made a fair point. Stock prices go up and down, so there's no guarantee the stock is still even worth the same amount as what you paid for it. So the correct remedy here would be just to give the wife 5 of those shares. Okay, Clark, your hand went up, it went down.
Yeah, you said the presumption is that if one spouse makes first, the other one's okay with it. But you said that, so I'm very confused by the end of that. Was if they're not okay with it, then
well, imagine you have a married couple. The husband goes and buys a new sports car without the wife's permission, right? And then they get divorced. So let's say the car is $100,000. That's $100,000 that she cannot obtain in a settlement, right? Because it's money paid to the car dealership.
Okay.
So she might tell the husband, "Okay, you blew $100,000 without my permission to buy a sports car. That means I get another $50,000 paid out for a distribution of assets." Right? You can't equitably divide money that was paid to a car dealership, right? So you say because this money was improperly spent, I should get $50,000 more than I would have had otherwise. Marty?
Why something you just gotta have it written?
No. Well, I mean, realistically, that never happens, but you run a risk if you don't. Right? Getting married in Texas ain't easy, right? There are risks because if you make a purchase and your spouse later says that was not something that I concurred with, you went and you bought, $100,000 sports car. I never concurred to that. That may come back to bite you later and saying, well, then you have to add it to the payout of the assets. You have to sell the car to make the spouse whole, even if the car's no longer worth $100,000. Free?
Even though say they are fine with it, it's still 50% there, right?
Well, yes and no. So if they concur with it, then they really can't complain the money was taken out of the community later. But the more likely one is they really say nothing about it, and then as a divorce, they complain about it. Right? That's usually what happens. I mean, it happens with married couples where spouse number one buys from that spouse number two permission, right? You buy lunch or something, right? You're not going to ask permission every day, but for a big purchase, they can seek to claw that back. Hey, Darvish.
For a piece of real property, would there just be a first settlement?
Yeah. We'll get to the joint tenancy in a few moments, but that's basically the right answer, right? Let's say the husband bought Blackacre. Presumptively, that's now a marital asset, and because it's community property, you'd have to sell it and then divvy up the proceeds. Unless you want to be a tenant with your ex-wife or your ex-spouse, which would probably not be the most pleasant idea. I suppose you could, but then the court might find good cause for partition there. All right. A couple other points. Rentals. This is a rule that's sort of unique to Texas. If you have a property owned from if you have separate property, in Blackacre, and you had Blackacre before the marriage, that's yours. Well, if there's a tenant on Blackacre, and the tenant's paying a rent. In Texas, that rent is considered community assets. So even if you own Blackacre on your own, it was a property you owned prior to the marriage, your rental income is still considered community property. You cannot keep that separate. Yes, Gabriel, then Angela. I'm sorry, you were right in the same line. I'm sorry. So Gabriel first, then Angela.
So with that in mind, is the rental income that you put towards the upkeep, like back into the property tax, considered part of that too, or is it just?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why Texas has a rule that it has. If you have a rental property, you're probably putting community property into it to upkeep it, to maintain it. So the idea is it's basically going to be a community property. And I think that rule actually kind of makes sense, right? Any rental property you have, you need to invest in it, make repairs. And it's hard to do that with segregated funds, with separate funds. Angela.
I'm just confirming that applies to rental income from after they get married, not the income that they were earning from the.
Correct. Right. Well, I mean, money you earn before your marriage cannot be marital property because the marriage doesn't exist yet, right? But if you own Blackacre, then you get married, you get a monthly rent check. That rent check is considered community property, and it's subject to the 50-50 split. Right. So it's very hard to keep your stuff separated if you're a married couple in Texas or otherwise. All right. Other questions? Yes, Sophia.
So the like say it's community property from the moment you get married, and then like you're not really acting like it's not like I'm giving half of it to my significant other, like, but at the end of like say you're married 2 years, so then they can back claim all of that.
You're talking about divorce, right?
Yes.
Right. This only matters at a divorce. Right. At a divorce, when the court is calculating how much money you have to divide, they would go back and they would count how many rent checks you got, and they would add that all together. Right. It doesn't matter where you keep it. Like, it doesn't matter if it's in a joint account or wherever else. Divorce lawyers are very good at this, right? Divorce lawyers find the money, and they'll go back as far as they need to determine it. And I mean, you talk about civil procedure. There's discovery, right? There's discovery to figure out, okay, how much was your rent check? Because maybe the other spouse is sort of in the dark about it. Maybe they don't even know how much is this being paid. But one of the things you do in civil divorce is to obtain discovery and request bank records, pay stubs, canceled checks. You can do that sort of discovery. Yes, Marty.
I think one of the spouses has a corporation right before they get married, and then after marriage, that they purchase the new properties on their dad.
Yeah, no, that's no good, right? I mean, look, if it's actually, let me answer the question carefully. If the person's like a real estate developer and this is actually like, a property for his business, then that's not marital property. But if it turns out that he's using this as a way to shield assets from his wife, good luck, right? Because look, I mean, you're not supposed to do that. If this is actually you're buying stuff personally, then you can't, because it's your marital property that you're using it for. Right? Married people are allowed to be real estate developers. You're allowed to do that, but I don't think you can evade community property laws by putting everything under your corporation. I'm sure people try. I'm sure, like, spouses don't always know what their other spouse are doing, but it can burn you if later some judge says, you know what, Blackacre, that's actually marital property. Good luck, you own 50% of it. And this is a broader point. If you want to obtain a mortgage in Texas and you're married, the bank is almost certainly going to demand your wife sign off on it, for the reason we've discussed before, right? They don't want to be in a situation where they're a creditor trying to reach your assets, but only one of the partners is there. So they're going to want both husband and wife, both couples, to sign off on it, I think. All right, what with me so far? Okay, we can move on. Yeah, Texas is unique about the rental of property. I think California, other states don't have that rule, but Texas, Idaho, Louisiana are a few unique states. All right. Let's talk about the concept of commingling. I mentioned this phrase, I think, last class. Commingling. Commingling is where you have some sort of separate fund of money and you mix in community funds, right? That act of commingling can convert a separate bank account into a community bank account. And once you commingle it, it's very hard to unmingle. That's even a word, right? it's very hard to revert back to the original status. It's possible. To do it, you must do it in writing. The actual legal term is called transmute. 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 Transmute refers to formally changing or transmuting the nature of property. That is, converting separate property to community property or converting community property separate property. That almost certainly should be in writing. It doesn't have to be, but really should be in writing. And both spouses should sign it, and they should probably have counsel also. Because you go, oh, I didn't know what I was signing, and she just puts it in my face, right? So you probably want counsel advising both sides. This becomes important when couples move. We'll get to this later in class. If you're moving from New York to Texas to retire, or you're moving from Texas to Florida to retire, you should be aware of how your property is titled. If you take no action, property retains its title. So if it's already community property, it stays community. If it's separate, it stays separate. But the transmutation, that's a funny word, transmutation is a way to formally change the status of your property. Any questions so far? All right, let's go on to divorce. In a community property state, the courts do what's called equitable division or equitable distribution. Equitable division or equitable distribution. You'll see it both ways. It's not equal distribution, it's equitable distribution. So in theory, at least, each spouse has a 50% share of whatever they own. But in reality, the courts can chop it up differently. And they can consider a range of factors when using distribution. For example, who was at fault for the breakup of the marriage? Infidelity usually puts you in trouble. If you're worse off if you engage in infidelity, or at least if you get caught, I suppose. Right? But that's terrible. But I'm going to stop. The court considers whether there's unequal earning potential if one spouse earns more than the other. Health, for example. If you're like Albert Pujols' wife and you just got brain cancer and he divorces you, you have to see this. Famous baseball player, his wife had brain surgery, divorced her the next day. Yeah.
A long time coming.
As a good Christian, he said. He says a good Christian, which means he was probably anyway. Yeah, it was opening day. She had brain surgery on opening day. They divorced her the next day. Okay. Anyway, are there children who has custody? The courts consider a range of factors when they're equitably distributing the assets. So in theory, at least, it's 50-50. But maybe going back to your question over here, the court may decide the wife has really not much money and maybe gives her 6 or 7 shares, right? But that's what she has to sort of live off of, and that's how it works. All right, everyone okay with that? In a community property state, there's no dower or courtesy. I told you, don't worry about it. I mean, it's really here. Don't worry about it. It doesn't exist in Texas. Okay. In community property states, there's really not a tenancy by the entirety, and I'll explain why in a minute. There's also not really a joint tenancy either, but it's kind of not obvious why. So it's Margot, right? Molly, oh, it's so close. Molly, I'm sorry. Molly, let me ask you a question. Remind us, what is a joint tenancy? Right? The 4 unities. The 4 unities. Very good. And what's the interest unity? Help me out there. Remember that one? So interest is one of the unities, right? What is the interest unity? Good, shares, right? Plural, right? The very definition of a joint tenancy is that the joint tenants have equal and undivided shares. Plural, right? They have the same share. Whatever one has, the other one has, right? Okay, good. Marty, let me ask you this question. In a community property state, can a husband and wife have separate shares?
50-50, so they're presumably separate from each other?
No. Look what I said before. Can they have separate shares?
No, I mean, since it's 50-50, you're kind of sharing
The same.
same share.
They each have a 50% ownership of the same share, right? There's one interest. Whatever they have, there's one interest. Husband has 50%, wife has 50%. Okay? So, Madi, let me ask you the question one more time. In a community property state like Texas, can a husband wife have a joint tenancy?
I think so.
No, the answer is no. All right, so now let me sort of amend your notes for the last month or so. When we're talking about joint tenancies, everything I've told you before today for joint tenancies is in a common law jurisdiction. I'm amending your notes like for the last 5 classes, right? Anytime you have a joint tenancy before today, we've talked about it in the context of a common law jurisdiction. The reason why is that in Texas, the idea of a joint tenancy doesn't work for married couples. It can't work because they can't have separate shares. They need to have only one share, which they have 50% of each. Not shares plural, shares singular. Everyone with me? Okay. But wait a minute, Josh. Don't married couples in Texas have joint tenancies? They do. So here's what I'm getting at. A joint tenancy in Texas is different than a joint tenancy in New York. They're both called joint tenancies, but they're not the same thing. They operate differently. All right. I have a label that I use. You're welcome to use it. You won't find it in any book, but it helps me. And if you don't want to use it, that's fine. I won't mind. I use the phrase a quasi joint tenancy for a community property state, right? When you're in a community property state and a husband and wife create a joint tenancy, I call it a quasi joint tenancy. Why quasi? Because it's similar to a joint tenancy, but it's different, right? It has many of the same features, but it's different. I encourage you to distinguish these concepts. If you apply the common law rules of a joint tenancy in Texas, you'll get the question completely wrong. The joint tenancies operate very, very differently. Everyone with me? All right, so let's walk through some of the differences. The biggest difference is the interest prong, right? With the joint tenancy we've studied before, they have separate but undivided shares, plural. But in Texas, there's only one share, one interest, and they split that interest in half. That makes a difference. Okay. A second difference. In a regular joint tenancy in most states, one joint tenant can sell his share, and that's fine. It destroys unities and creates a tenancy in common, right? But in Texas, there are no separate shares. One spouse can't sell his separate share because it doesn't have a separate share. The only way that a joint tenancy can be sold in Texas is if both spouses consent, that both spouses sign off on the sale. So that's different. If you have a joint tenancy in Texas, one spouse can't sell out his interest without the other one's consent to it. As a practical matter, either get divorced or you agree. Those are your options. You can't go it alone. In this regard, it's like a tenancy by the entirety, where the quasi-joint tenancy functions like the tenancy by the entirety because both spouses must turn the key. They both must consent to the sale. All right? Everyone with me? Again, so there's only one share. They're not separate shares. Both spouses must consent to sell that share. The third difference is perhaps the biggest. In a common law state with a joint tenancy, this was called a right of survivorship. The right of survivorship, where the surviving spouse or the surviving tenant gets it. In Texas, there is no right of survivorship for joint tenancies. In Texas, with a joint tenancy, there is no right of survivorship. None. Andres?
Just want to make sure that when you're saying these taxes, we can also fill in.
California, whatever else. Yep. Yes, Bree. Community. I mean, I think I've only ever asked about Texas and California because those are the ones. But yes, you have to know it. Yeah, sure, why not? It's open book exam, so you can check your list. This is why I give an open book exam, because I don't want you to have to waste your time memorizing those 11 states. It's just not a good use of your brain cells. No, sure. I mean, there's something you should memorize, some things you don't need to memorize. That's something I don't care if you memorize. All right, but the last part I said is very important. Neither question it was about, right? There is no survivorship right for joint tenancies in Texas. So you might ask yourself, why do you even call it a joint tenancy? You shouldn't, right? I don't like even calling it a joint tenancy because it creates confusion, but you will see deeds in Texas, husband and wife calling it joint tenancy because it exists for unmarried couples, right? You could even have a boyfriend and girlfriend living together with a joint tenancy and maybe they get married, right? It was from before marriage, which stays in that capacity. So you can have a married couple with a joint tenancy. But if you're husband and wife and you create a new joint tenancy, it functions in a very different fashion. Okay, we'll get the difference. The biggest one's the last one. There's no survivorship rights. This is the quickest way for me to trick you on the exam. I'll say you're in Texas. I'll give you a joint tenancy and one spouse dies. Let's see what you do there. If you say right of survivorship, you lose. Right? You've lost the question. Right? I know I've tricked you. So I'm warning you a month before the exam what I'm going to ask you, and you'll still fall for it. So it's look, I know it. I know how this happens. It's fine. Because I give you 100 of these warnings, right? You can't remember all the warnings, right? It's not even fair, I suppose. What's that? That's fine. They're joint tenants. That's fine. It's only if a joint tenancy is created during marriage. Correct. Yeah, and that's the example I gave before. If there's a boyfriend and girlfriend with a joint tenancy, they get married, it remains titled as a joint tenancy. Probably, unless they do something to change it, which they can do also. There are risks to getting married. I mean, that sounds awful to say, but your property will change characterization when you get married often because of the way payments are made. So there's a risk. I'm sorry. Yeah, Clark.
Does the half thing go to the air?
I don't want to do that yet. We'll get to the next. You want to do it now? I'll do it now. All right. No. Okay, we'll do it now. All right. All right. Let's do so again 450 if you turn to your books, please. Don't even have their books. These books you have to read. Anyway, online. Okay, online, sure. Do people actually have the hardcover books? You have them somewhere? Okay. Yeah. Okay, I'm glad you have. I mean, I really don't care which one you use. It doesn't matter to me. Okay. So there's a problem on page 450, right? The husband's married to the wife. Husband saves $5,000 for his own earnings and deposits in a savings account in his own name. Then the husband withdraws $5,000, buys the lot, taking title as joint tenants, husband and wife. It doesn't really matter what they call it, right? If a husband buys some piece of property during his marriage, it's community property. You call it whatever you want. It doesn't matter what you call it. Does it matter if it comes from a separate account? It does not matter. Okay? So then the husband dies, leaving all of his property to his son. Right? So Trey, in this case, is there a right of survivorship with this tenancy? Why not? Correct. There's no right of survivorship. Now, Trey, here comes a harder question. Can the husband leave all of his property to the son from the prior marriage? Can he do that in a community property state?
Not by himself. He can't make that decision alone.
Okay. Can he cut his wife out of his will entirely? what is the wife entitled to, Trey?
Entitled to that,
What percentage, Trey?
100%.
Not 100%.
She's entitled to, I mean, he can elect to leave his interest to her.
He could. That'd be the nice thing to do, but he didn't. But my question is, what's the wife entitled to,
I guess I don't know.
Cameron?
50%.
50% of what?
Uh,
Here comes the hard part. 50% of what?
the assets from the marriage.
I'm talking about Blackacre here, right? Blackacre was worth $5,000. What is the wife's interest in the lot going to be? Everyone always says 50%, but 50% of what? It's a piece of land.
Yeah, but
It's like the stock question Victoria had earlier.
it would purchase
Yeah,
community property.
it was. All right, let's take a step back. Okay, this is actually a very hard question. Let's look at question number 3. This will be for Kyle in a moment. All right, let me read it to you. Question 3. It says, husband and wife are married in Texas. Each saves $5,000 from his own earnings, which deposits in a savings account in his own name. Husband withdraws $5,000 and buys Blackacre. Then the husband and wife take title as joint tenants. Kyle, does it matter if he took the money from his own account, or does any of that matter here?
No, because it was happening while they were.
Doesn't matter. Correct. Okay, so this is community property, Blackacre. Husband dies. His will leaves all the separate and community property to his son. Which of the following statements are true? This is for all of you to put your answer in. The wife owns 0% of Blackacre, and the son owns 100%. The wife owns 50% of Blackacre, and the son owns 50%. The wife owns 75% of Blackacre, and the son 25%. The wife owns 100, and the son owns 0%. Okay. All right. Let's see. We got 50 people. All right. All right, Kyle. So help me. Let's walk through this one, please. During life, right? During the marriage, what was the breakdown of Blackacre? Who owned what?
It would be 50-50 between the husband and the.
All right. The husband owns 50 and the wife owns 50. Okay. Here's the harder question, Kyle. The husband owns 50% of Blackacre. How much of that is he allowed to give to his heirs? And how much of that will go to his spouse?
I think 50% would go to his heirs and 50% to his spouse
50% of what?
of Blackacre.
Can he control all 50%?
Well, he has 50% and.
Right. Okay. So let's get it. That's where I'm going. Right. The husband has a 50% share, right? The husband has a 50% share. Of his 50% share, how much can he give to his heirs? And how much goes to his wife? She's right. When you own community property, right? It's a 50-50 split. The husband can control half of his interest, right? The husband can control half of his interest and put it in his will. What is half of his interest? It's half of 50%, which is 25%. The father can only leave 25% of Blackacre to his son. The other 25% of the father's share goes to the wife. Kyle, what was the wife's share beforehand at the start of this?
50%.
So the wife has her own 50%, And then what does she receive on top of that? So what's the answer here? The answer is C. See what we did in this one. The answer is C. Oh boy. Yee. Other class did better on this one. Okay. I always compare. You guys are usually, but anyway, this was a little bump here. Okay. The answer here is C, but I wanted to make sure you all understand why. Law students hate fractions, but you have to do fractions here. I'm sorry. There's no other way. During the marriage, right? During the marriage, it's 50-50, right? Husband's 50%, wife is 50%. That 50% belongs to the husband. But not really, right? Because the husband can only control half of his interest, right? He can control half of his interest. Upon his death, he can control where half of it goes. So he can give half of it to his kid, but the other half is for his wife. Basically, whatever you have, whatever interest you have, you really only have half of it. So even though you think you have a 50-50 split, you only control half of your interest, right? The husband's 50%, the wife is 50%. But think about that for a minute, right? The husband controls half of his interest, 25, and the other half is for his wife. So they each have each other's 25%, right? It's kind of a weird concept, but they each have 50%, their own 25%, and the 25% from the other. But the husband cannot give his entire interest to his son. If you don't understand what I said, that's fine. It's sort of a hard thing to keep in mind. But you have to remember is he can only give half of his interest. If the father's interest is 50%, he can only leave half of it to his son. I saw Alyssa, then Madi, and then Armin.
So there's technically not a right of survivorship, but the surviving spouse will be guaranteed 75%.
I really don't want you to say that, but you're correct. You're 100% correct, but don't say 75%. Actually, you have to work it through because it will not always be 75%. It usually will be. But everyone what Alyssa just said, right? If this was in New York, what percentage would the wife get? No, in New York. If this was a common law state, was a joint tenancy, what does the wife get? Why would it be 100%? Correct, yes, ma'am. If this was New York with a right of survivorship, the wife gets 100%. But here, what does she get?
75.
So in some regards, the wife is worse off, right? She would have been better off if she was in New York. She would have had 100% survivorship. Now she's sort of stuck with this ingrate son who gets only a quarter, and there'll probably be a partition by sale to divide up. That's probably what's going to happen here. But it's not always going to be 75%. It might be a little quirky. But the wife's always going to be taking basically half of the husband's share. Madi, the Armin?
So if the husband dies without a will, if they have like two sons, the two sons share the 25%?
Right. So if the husband dies without a will, the wife would get her 25%, and the remaining heirs will split the other 25%. Yeah, I think that's what would happen.
So if, compared to the common law states, the shares are different.
The shares are different. Yeah. Yeah, Armin.
My question is essentially the same as this is.
Okay. Gabriel, then Tony.
So he and his wife took title as joint tenants.
Correct.
So now, if there's no right of survivorship, then the son and the wife have the same common, or
Yes, right. I think that's correct. If the in this hypothetical, the son would have a 25% interest, the wife 75% in common. I think that's correct. Yes. Yeah, Tony.
So in this case, say in acres, do they bring like a surveyor out? Could the wife say you're going to get?
You could do partition in kind or do by sale. You do either way. All right, but the point I want you to get is why is it 75, not 50? Because about half of you got this question wrong. The reason why it's 75 is the wife already has her half, right? She cannot get only half because she has half to begin with, right? That's how you know that answer has to be wrong. She has half to begin with. The only question is, what is she getting from the husband? She can't get 0 from the husband. She gets half of the husband's share, which is 25. 50 plus 25 is equal to 75. right? I think D is actually a better answer than B. B just it can't be right because that would basically say the wife gets nothing. The wife has to get something from the husband. Caitlin, because of community property, the wife never gets nothing, right? And I mean that somewhat facetiously, but to be serious, the wife will always get some interest in Blackacre, right? It's almost impossible for a spouse to keep his other spouse out of the will and give her nothing. Whenever the spouse dies and there's community property, the other spouse gets something. There's got to be some number greater than 50%. Alyssa, I sort of jumped in her. It's not always 75%. It usually will be, but 75. If you're not sure, say 75%. That's a good guess. Anwar.
In community property, can you like choose to be tenancy common instead?
No. No, and that's an important point. Even if a married couple wrote a conveyance saying Blackacre titled as tenants in common, it wouldn't matter. It's still going to be this quasi-joint tenancy, this sort of community property, which is why I'm telling you, I don't really care what you call it. It doesn't matter what you call it. I'll call it community property. But you'll see on the deed titled as joint tenancy. That's how you'll see it. And that's also why I think I told you the tenancy by the entirety doesn't really exist in Texas. It doesn't need to, right? By definition, you can't convey a joint tenancy if you're married, so you don't need to call it a tenancy by the entirety. It doesn't add anything to the debate. Three.
What's the dominate, the location of the marriage is the location of the property?
So this is kind of quirky. It doesn't matter where you get married. Let's say you get married in New York, and then you move down to Texas and you buy Blackacre. That's community property, my friend, right? It's property acquired while you're married in a community state. It doesn't really matter where you were married. It matters where the property is at the time.
You're married in New York, you're living in New York, you buy Texas property
Well, where are you living though?
in New York. I want to buy a vacation.
We'll get to that issue later. That's different. I thought you moved. If you move down, vacation home actually is very hard in a third state. We'll do that later. Right. I mean, the harder one is if you live in Texas and you buy vacation home in Florida. That's the hardest one, right? Because Florida is a common law state. We'll get there a little bit later. The migrating couple issues are really complex. People don't realize it, but it can really mess things up. All right. Questions on question number 3. All right. Let's move on. Gifts. This is kind of a quirky rule, but if you are in a marriage and in a community property state and you give a gift to someone, you should probably make sure your spouse consents to that gift. Because if they don't, you did the reading, right? You know it's getting it, right? The spouse can request the gift back, or at least half the gift back. This arises very often with adultery, and as the book says, a lady friend. If the husband's buying presents for his lady friends, presumably the wife is not signing off on those gifts. And guess what? She can ask for the lady friends to return half of the gifts because she did not consent. This is sort of like Madi's question a few minutes ago with the sports car, right? If both spouses do not consent to the payment of money, in a divorce proceeding, the spouse can request half of that back, saying, look, he gave this girlfriend $200,000. I didn't consent to this. As a result, our community assets were reduced by $200,000. Give me half. Give me $100,000 back. Yeah.
My question kind of went along. Instead of giving money, you actually give them
Jewelry, cars.
jewelry. You just ask for.
Guess what? The mistress has to sell it.
Okay, so it's not like it won't be taken out of the husband.
Or okay, well, yeah. So it depends how vindictive the spouse might be, right? Right. No, I'm being serious, right? Let's just say that there was $1 million in the community property, and he'd given some other girl $1 million in gifts, right? You could take the entire community saying, this is everything. You don't get your half. You give everything to us. But what if the amount of money he paid out exceeds what's remaining in the community? You could actually force a sale of the goods at auction. Jewelry. I mean, you can't recover everything. Well, it's a vacation, right? You can't get money back for a vacation. Cars don't keep their value very well, right? Maybe jewelry does. I don't know, but cars depreciate in value every year. So you can imagine where the amount of money that the adulterer owes his wife exceeds what's remaining in the community, then they have to go to their assets. Support otherwise.
How do they track?
Oh, they track. Lawyers. I mean, look, I'm not being facetious. Do you remember the name Donald Sterling, who is the owner of the Los Angeles Clippers? Does that name just ring a bell to you guys? And he was a billionaire. I mean, this guy just more money than anyone, right? And he had a V. Stiviano, was that her name? And he had this girlfriend for many years, and apparently the wife knew about it. But then things just blew up, and the wife actually went after the girlfriend's gifts, and then she won in court. And she had to return. There was a car, there was jewelry, and I don't think what's her name? Donald Sterling's wife. I can't remember her name, but she maybe didn't really need the money, but it was more of like a principal matter. So yeah, they go after the girlfriend.
He's like forensic accountants or
I mean, look, unless you're like when you're buying a car, there's records of the car, right? When you're buying a house, there's tax receipts. I mean, there are different things that lawyers who do divorce law. I mean, if you go to divorce law, I mentioned discovery earlier. A lot of your job is actually determining what the assets are to acquire. Yeah. Which is fun.
Yeah, sure, they get.
Oh no, this is not. It's ugly work. I mean,
dollars on.
and look, the lawyers always get paid, right? So the lawyers are getting paid no matter what. Yes, Armin.
Is the recovery, if you have to sell the car, is the recovery the amount that you bought it for, or the amount that it's sold?
No, the amount the gift was for. So let's say they bought a car for $100,000 and it's depreciated to 80,000. You sold 20 grand. Right. So again, if you're, I shouldn't say this. If you're in Texas, you're having an affair. Maybe use cash. Right. No, that's not what I meant to say. That scratch that. Scratch that. But my point. It's on YouTube. It's okay. No, but really, you get burned, right? If you make a payment without your spouse's consent. There's an example of the W.C. Fields in the book who spent all this money as lady friends, as they called it. Okay. Her name was Shelley Sterling. I had in my notes, Shelley Sterling. So she actually thought it was a $2 million house, a Ferrari, 2 Bentleys, and a Range Rover worth more than 500 grand. So we're talking about a lot of money, and she won. I mean, millions of dollars of gifts the guy given her over the years. Good for her. Yeah. Oh, yeah. All right. Yeah. I mean, that's. I mean, it's actually think about having an affair with a married guy in California is risky because you may have to pay it back later. It's not free. These stuff you learn property, right? Have the affair in Florida. No, I'm sorry. All right, let's go on. Any? I have too much fun. All right, any other questions? I heard you, but I heard that. I have very good hearing. I had to play it back, but I heard that. All right, I won't repeat it. Go away. Next. I think if you have to tell someone that, whatever, we're done. All right, move on. Yeah, you guys may have had some early. I don't know. All right. Mixing. Okay, so what happens if you have an installment contract? What's an installment contract? Let's say you promise to buy a house by paying, 100 installments over the course of 30 years, right? What happens if you start off unmarried using your separate funds, and then you finish the payments married using community property? The answer actually varies depending what state you're in. And again, this is only for installment contracts. This is not for insurance policies. So don't confuse these, right? Excuse me. Texas has what's called the inception of right rule. The inception of right rule. With the inception of right rule is if you start paying an installment contract before you're married, it stays as separate property when you get married. With the inception of right rule, if you start paying an installment contract before you get married, it maintains that characterization. It does not convert. So even if you're using community funds to pay off the installment contract, Blackacre remains separate property. Right? So I suppose if you're in Texas and if you start an installment contract, that's fine. This doesn't apply to mortgages either. It's specifically for installment contracts, which are a little bit different than mortgages, right? Installment contracts are rare, but they come up. Other states have what's called the time of vesting rule, right? The time of vesting rule. If you finish paying it off while you're married, it is going to be community property. If you finish paying off the installment contract while you're married, it's going to be community property. Okay, why does that matter? If you're in one of those states and you're using funds from the marriage to pay for it, it's basically converted into community property. There's a third rule, which is in California, which I don't want to spend too much time on because it's hard. It's called the pro rata rule, pro rata apportionment. Pro rata apportionment. So let's say that 50% of the installments were paid with separate funds and 50% were paid with community funds. That means it's a 50% community property and 50% separate property. Try figuring out how that works in reality. I can't tell you, right? But basically, the ownership is divided up based on how much was paid from the community funds and how much was paid from separate. It's a disaster. I don't even want to try to explain it. And what?
I have a question kind of ties back to previous address. So in California, it's community property. How did Brittle in your apartment turn that into a tenant income?
Why was it a tenant? That was with the boxing, right? You're talking about?
No,
No, that's sports bar. Oh, that's where the wife tries to write her husband out of the will, right?
yeah, it's common, but in community property, that tenant income is one thing. Kind of ties back why I asked the previous question.
Right. Okay. That was the case where the wife conveyed it to herself. Let me think for a second. I think there might have been a weird California quirk that I'm not remembering, but your question is actually a good one. I'm not sure. I'll check it later. But I think there might have been a weird California quirk. Yes, Trey. Yeah, I think then it's at the time of vesting. That's when the last payment was made. If you're not married, then it's separate property. It's possible though that in the divorce proceedings, the other spouse could probably seek the amount of money you paid into it. That might be the actual rule. Yeah, and it's a good question. I'll think about it some later. I'm not sure the answer. I don't want to give it off the top of my head. All right. Now let's do some mixing questions. All right, take a look at question 4A. And this will be for Zach in a moment. Question 4A. Let's read this one. It says, husband and wife are married in Texas. The husband purchases a $100,000 life insurance policy with his salary. The sole beneficiary of the policy is the son, S. The husband dies. Okay? Which of the following statements are true? The wife receives 0 and the son receives 100. Wife receives 25 and the son receives 75. Wife receives 50 and the son receives 50. Wife receives 100 and the son receives 0. Take some time to think of an answer. Should we put? Another 15 seconds. All right, Zach, let's walk through this one one step at a time. All right, so let's just do some basics of insurance law, which maybe you knew, maybe you don't know. I'm not sure. The other class they didn't, so I want to walk through this. When you buy an insurance policy for $100,000, what are you actually giving the insurance company? What do you actually have to pay them? You pay a premium every month, right? Will that be more or less than $100,000? Probably depends how long you live for, right? Right. You're all young and healthy, God willing, right? If you want to get an insurance policy, companies will just say, yes, we'll give you one, right? But it won't last forever. It might last for 10 years, 20 years. When you get to your 50s and 60s and 70s, it gets harder because you're more likely to die. I know that sounds awful, but that's what insurance companies do. They're saying, let's pay a risk, right? Can I take money from you and pay you nothing back, right? Can I take your money for an insurance policy, which I'll never have to pay out because you're young and healthy, you're not going to die? Now, if you're hit by a bus or something or a COVID, that's actually a huge issue. A lot of insurance companies got washed because a lot of younger people actually died because of COVID. They were healthy, no issues. But in general, insurance policies are a good bet because people are not going to actually ever use it. They're not going to die. Okay. Zach, with an insurance policy for the $100,000, is there any present interest in that money? Is there any guarantee that money's ever actually paid out? Can you like ask an insurance company, "Hey, I'm still alive, but can you give me my money now?" Does that work? No. You actually can. You can basically take a loan from an insurance, but that's not what I'm asking about here, right? As a general matter, with an insurance policy, there's no present interest. Now here comes the big question: is that $100,000 marital property?
I would say yes, because the money that he purchased it with was marital property.
Okay. Now, and I'll be very careful. Does that $100,000 exist yet? Is it any account?
No,
Does it? When will the wife, for example, get that money, if ever?
after the husband dies.
Will it be marital property then? So let me ask the question one more time, Zach. Today, right now, is that 100 grand? Is that marital property? Correct. All right. This is an important point, right? The life insurance policy itself is a contract, right? You have a contract with an insurance company. That's a marital asset because it's being paid for with marital property, right? The policy itself, the contract itself, that is marital property. However, the 100 grand, that will never be marital property because it will only be paid out after the husband's dead, at which point the marriage is dissolved. Right? There's no present interest. There's no marital property in the 100 grand. It might happen in the future. And again, what happens if the husband commits suicide or does something else to avoid the policy? Maybe he does make his payments. There are a lot of things that can happen. Insurance companies love canceling insurance. Like, oh, I'm sorry, you missed one payment 17 years ago. That means they're not going to pay you a penny, right? Don't laugh. It's true. If you have an insurance policy, don't skip a bill because they'll cancel it on you. They'll keep taking your money. They just won't pay it out. Yeah. If they find that you skipped a payment, they can void your policy. It's true. Or if they find that perhaps your death was under suspicious circumstances, right? They may hold it. If everyone always asks me, what happens if they all die in a plane crash, right? This is actually where it matters, right? If there's no body, they may not pay out the insurance policy, right? They may need a body. I mean, this might sound grotesque, but after 9/11, there were no bodies, right? They're incinerated, right? People, there were no bodies, and they actually had to go through pretty elaborate legal process to actually get a death certificate without the absence of a body. You had to prove you were on one of the planes, or maybe you were at work that day. I mean, it's only recently, in the last a year, they're still finding DNA of people from ground zero, still to this day, 20 years later. It's remarkable, but yeah, you need a body usually. So there's no guarantee that money ever pays out. Maybe the person, assumed another identity and went to live off an island somewhere. You never know. Yes, Tristan.
Is there any difference in insurance policy and
Insurance policy and what?
the life insurance or permanent life insurance policy versus the term?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is beyond the scope of this class, but a term life insurance policy only lasts for a certain number of years, 5 years or 10 years, right? You can also have the insurance company give you a rate that will be good till the day you die, but it's going to be a lot higher, right? If you all get a term policy, it's going to be cheap because you're young and healthy, but good luck getting that when you're older. Right. Again, insurance companies give you money. I'm sorry, will take your money hoping they never have to give it back to you, right? That's why these companies exist. And they're very smart at figuring out, okay, this is a person, here's his health, here's his age, here's where he live. Here's how long he's going to live, and they will not give you any policy beyond that.
But with the permanent insurance policy, since you can say you could cash it out.
You can't really. I mean, you can sell it, but it won't be for as much as if you wait till you die, right? There's a.
But I didn't know, like, if you're getting divorced, if the other spouse could argue. Get that value.
Oh, I see. So you have a life insurance policy, and you're getting divorced, and the wife will never get anything out of it. Yeah, the wife can actually ask for part of that insurance policy, or to actually keep you as a beneficiary, not to take you off. What gets really hard is with a pension, right? Let's say you're married to a person for however many years, and the person's earning a pension during this period, then you get divorced. You're still entitled to a percentage of the pension for the years you were married to that person, because you contribute to the accumulation of that pension, right? And even if the person gets remarried, his second spouse comes after the first spouse for pension payouts. Isn't that kind of crazy? Yes, Alyssa.
So in this question, the wife is not gonna get, she's not entitled to.
Oh, what's the answer? We didn't. I took the answer. Did I? It's C. Right? Oh, I didn't explain why. I got so distracted. Let me explain why. I'm sorry. You guys are so good. You're always asking these nice questions. Let me answer it. Okay. During marriage, this is why Zach jumped off, right? During marriage, they have no present interest in the money, right? There's no present interest in the money. None. The payment will only be paid out if the husband dies and dies under the correct circumstances, not a suicide, for example. Okay? The general rule is that in a community property state, a spouse can only direct the payment of half of his assets. Half. So the father, the husband left half everything to a son. He can't do that. The most he can leave to a son is half of his interest. And what is that interest? Half of 100,000, which is 50. The other half must go to his wife. So the answer here is C, is 50-50. Oh. I know, with the other one with Blackacre, right?
No, because I thought we had just said that 100,000 doesn't get paid out until the marriage is
Correct.
all.
But the husband can only direct half of his interest.
Oh, okay.
And his interest is 100. Right. Usually the question again, this one is, wait a minute, Josh, why is it not 25-75, right? Someone want to ask that? Okay, the reason why. Blackacre is a present interest. You own it during life. And during life, the husband has a 50% interest in Blackacre. Right? The insurance policy, there is no present interest. There's only a future interest in what pays out after his death. And the husband can control, again, half of his interest. Whatever the husband's interest is, he controls half. In question number 3, his interest was half of Blackacre. He can control half of that. But in question 4A, he owns the entirety of the life insurance policy. He can set as his beneficiaries. He controls everything, but the law says you control half of that. You'll control half of what the insurance policy pays out. 1 second, guys. If you're in Texas and you're signing up for a life insurance policy and you're married, the insurance company is going to demand that you put your wife as leave a half beneficiary. They won't even let you sign it without it, right? This is almost malpractice to even write out a life insurance policy in Texas with only your son as a beneficiary. Trey, then Marty? Okay.
Not marital property at all.
But the policy was, though. You have to, don't forget, the marital proceeds, the community property is being used to buy the policy. That made this is why I said before to Marty, the policy itself was marital property. And because the policy itself was marital property, the wife gets half whatever pays out. Marty?
Is there such thing like a dual policy, like one policy with a person together and at the same time under the same policy?
Well, usually one person dies at a time, so I'm not sure how that would work. Right, because if your life insurance policy, they can't both die at the same time. This is this question everyone loves asking, but there's only a life insurance policy is for each person who might die. Is there another hand somewhere? Yes, Clark, and then Caitlin.
Just to be clear, so if he was just leaving $100,000 and trying to leave it all, then that's the 75-25.
No. For $100,000 cash, it's the same, be 50-50. If the husband has a bank account of $100,000, I leave this entire bank account to my wife, to my son, The wife still gets half. This is the question we had before with the bank. With
I thought she would get 75.
no, the 75% only works with Blackacre.
Real property.
But we have to understand the reason why. The reason why is that with the joint tenancy during life, it's a 50-50 ownership, right? Okay, let me try this again. Okay.
Oh, no, I get it. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's a joint tenancy. It's not just like
Right.
Your money. But okay.
Let me try this again because if you're confused, others are confused. Let me try this one more time. Okay. And this happens every year at this exact point. With the joint tenancy during life, there's a 50-50 ownership. Right. The husband can direct half of his interest. His interest is only 50%. So he can direct 25 to his son, 25 to his wife. With cash, right? Let's say it's $100,000 in the bank. It's 50-50, right? The husband can direct half of his interest. So in that case, it's 75-25. The wife would get $75,000 and the son gets $25,000, right? Whatever you have, you direct half. The reason why the insurance is 50-50 and not 75-25 is that there's no present interest. It all comes after the death of what the husband can direct, right? If it's some present interest, whether it's Blackacre, that's why I call it, it's not real property. If it's any present interest, whether it's a bank account or some land interest, it's going to be a 75-25 split.
That's what I mean.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
Good. But if it's an insurance policy, there's no present interest, then it goes to 50-50. Everyone see that? I think I saw a couple. Caitlin here was up from a few minutes ago.
Was there a present interest during the
Correct. If there's something present, it's the same rule. But if there's something present, the wife already has an interest. She already has 50% to start off with, right? That's why it's 50 plus half of the husband's 50, which is 25. But if it's for something like an insurance policy comes after death, then it's going to be the 50-50 split. Right.
So even then, that being said, does the inception of right rule apply to insurance policy?
No, I told you it doesn't. It only applies to installment contracts. Does not apply to mortgages, does not apply to insurance contracts. Bree?
Are we going to talk about the difference with mortgages and installment contracts? Is that just like another class at some other time?
Not this class. No, I don't think it particularly matters much. You'll do mortgages in property too, so we will, I guess, suppose get to it next semester. But with a mortgage, there are different theories of it, but the leading theory is you basically acquire the property at once, right? There's not this sort of, even though you're making payments to the course of say 30 or 40 years, you're assumed to have title to the property right away. So it doesn't really match this sort of dynamics. All right, again, if there's a present interest of some sort, whether it's land or money, it's going to be a 75-25 split. Not always. This is a list question a few minutes ago, but probably. Because the husband directs half of his interest and the wife gets half of the other one. For life insurance policies, it's going to be a 50-50 split because there's no present interest involved. Does that make sense? It's hard. I mean, it's not an easy topic. Let's try example 4B. This is going to be for Caitlin. I think you're next, actually. Be for you. Oh, if you're right. Okay. Let me read it to you. Husband purchases a $100,000 life insurance. I'm sorry, H, not husband. H. H. See what I did there? I did the wrong thing. H purchases a $100,000 life insurance policy. H pays 10 grand in premiums. The beneficiary is his son. Husband and wife get married. H and W get married. Now he's paying the remaining $50,000 in premiums, and he dies. Which of the following statements are true? The wife receives 25. I'm sorry, the wife receives 0. The son receives 100. Wife receives 25, and the son receives 75. Wife receives 50, son receives 50. Wife receives 100, son receives 0. Take 30 seconds to think about it. All right, another 15 seconds. All right, Caitlin, let's walk through this, okay? So this question differs from the other one because the policy was purchased prior to the marriage, right? Some premiums were paid before the marriage, and others were paid after the marriage. What's the significance, Caitlin, the fact that some of the premiums were paid with marital assets? Make what community property? The entire policy. Okay. Is this policy going to be a community asset or a marital asset or separate asset? Why do you say that? Okay, that's right. This is going to remain, and it actually doesn't matter what state you're in. Someone said in the class, what state doesn't matter. But the actual policy itself is going to remain separate. So therefore, can the husband designate the son as the sole beneficiary? If it's a separate policy, is the husband required to give a share of the policy to his wife? No. So what's your answer here? You put A. Okay, let's see what people put. Oh wow, look at that. Interesting. Why'd you put A? Because what? Gennady, what'd you put? Why'd you put B? Correct. So the answer here is B. All right, look at that. Let me explain why though. I'm sorry, C. 50-50. Sorry. I did the wrong thing. I'm sorry. No. Oh, I'm sorry. It's late. I'm sorry. 25-75. The answer is B. I was right the first time. I'm sorry. I just had a brain slip. Okay, let me explain this. I'm sorry. Gennady, what did you say? You 25-75, right? Yeah, you're right. She's correct. Let me explain why. The policy itself is separate, right? The policy was created beforehand. It's separate. All the wife can ask for, though, is half of the money put into it, right? He put in $50,000 of marital property into the policy for community assets. The wife can request half of that back, which is 25. So the 25 she's getting is not actually from the payout of the 100. The 25 she's getting is from the half of the money put into it. I'm sorry, I completely brain slipped that one up. I said it right the first time, I doubted myself. Bree?
Why didn't they commingle completely?
The policy started out as separate and remains a separate policy, right? It's not the inception rule, but that's sort of how it works, right? It's going to be a separate policy. You don't commingle an insurance policy. That's not something that happens. So the son remains the sole beneficiary. The wife can't take half of the insurance policy. But the most the wife can expect is to get half back of what she put into it, which is half 50, which is 25. And before the insurance company gives anything to the son, the insurance company will give 25 to the wife, give the rest to the son. Kevin? Correct. Correct. Andres, your hand?
Oh, yes, sorry, installment contracts, that doesn't include the mortgages and insurance policy.
No, it's not mortgages, and the installment contract is also for mortgages.
So yeah.
It's not really the inception rule, and I don't want to describe it like that. When the insurance policy is taken out, it begins as separate property, and the commingling doesn't change that, right? An installment contract is something where you basically take payments over the course of, let's say, 30 years, and you pay it off slowly. That's not how an insurance policy works. Insurance policy is an ongoing concern. In theory, you have to pay payments until the day you die. So it's not really the same thing. In other words, you think of the time of vesting rule. An insurance policy vests when you die, right? It doesn't ever end. So the insurance policy retains its characterization. It's not the inception rule. I wouldn't think of it that way. Okay with that? No? They're different rules, unfortunately. Yes.
For the time of vesting rule, even though he did the last payments, the last premium, because the policy doesn't, it's not paid off until he's dead.
Correct. There's no in other words, the inception rule and the time of vesting rule work because there's a fixed number of payments to be made. Right? Maybe that's a way of explaining it. With an installment contract, there's going to be 30 payments made or 100 payments made. You know it. But with an insurance contract, there's no fixed number of payments to be made. It's going to be when you die. It's over. Right? This is actually a huge problem. If people are very sick and they stop paying their insurance policy because they're short on their bills, guess what? They don't get their money for their life insurance. So that's actually an issue. Bree, does that answer your question also a little bit? Okay, I think I didn't do it right the first time. Joel?
So just clarifying, like the inception rule and the vesting rule don't apply here.
They're not relevant, right? That's rule that's only for, oh, I know what I confused you. I said it didn't apply to mortgages or insurance policies, which is correct. It's only for fixed length contracts. That's the way of looking at it. Now I know why you were asking. Okay. Yeah.
The facts of included how much she was paying for the life insurance, did she also get that as well? Besides the insurance payout?
All right. So it's actually a really good question, Anwar said, right? So let's say in question 4A, I told you how much community property is being paid. I think the wife would actually have a choice, so to speak. She'd probably take whichever's more, right? Her payout here is 75%, but the amount of money she paid in is probably less than that. I think she'd go with the 75% one. I think that'd be the answer. You could imagine where the amount of money you paid in was more than what the policy pays out, and the wife may actually seek the other one. So I guess you have an option which one you pick. All right, everyone with me? All right. I had 2 questions on the migrating couples. I don't want to rush it in 5 minutes because I won't do it well. So we'll start class on Tuesday with these 2 questions. All right, let me just wrap up a bit and I'll go over what we did, but make sure you have in advance these 2 questions for class on Tuesday. The migrating couple issue is actually very tricky. I do not want to rush it. So when we're talking about community property, always remember what is the sort of present interest? What is it that the couple has? If there's some present interest in property or money, they have a 50-50 split. And that's probably going to yield a 75-25 split upon death. 75 to the surviving spouse, 25 to the heir. With an insurance policy, though, there is no present interest, and it's probably going to be 50-50. The caveat, though, is question 4B, whereas if the policy was in existence before the marriage, then the best the spouse can hope for is half of the community assets paid for the premiums. I think that's right. All right. Again, do questions 5A and 5B on your own. We'll do them in class and do that. I don't want to rush them. All right. Thank you so much. I'll see you later.